Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How we doing? Breaking Spectre here for another edition of Midnight Rider. We'll call this the morning edition here today. Good to have you aboard. Today we are going to wrap up the Virtue of Selfishness, the 50th anniversary edition that we've been reading from here. This will be session number 6. We'll conclude the book with chapters 17, 18, and 19 here today. We'll round that out and see where we end up here at the end of the day and where we head next and go from there. So, that being said, we'll see you back here on the other side. As the saying goes, get woke, go broke. We, the people, recently learned that 200 woke corporations, part of the Civic Alliance, and 90 CEOs in a Zoom call, went on record to oppose election integrity laws in Georgia. These corporations think they know what's best for we, the people. These corporations think they wield more power than we, the people. These corporations openly flaunt and thwart the will of we, the people. These corporations hide behind legal terms like personhood, thereby giving said corporations, dead entities, rights like we, the people. These corporations virtue signal at every opportunity what values we, the people, should embody. We, the people, have forgotten how to play the game, and it's time we, the people, step into the light of the Great Awakening. We, the people, have more power than they know. We, the people, have the ability to vote with our dollars. We, the people, have had enough of the fraud and are collectively throwing up the window and yelling, "We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore." We, the people, keep our tongues from evil and our lips from speaking lies, while these corporations have given their mouth to evil and their tongues frame deceit. We, the people, will have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of these corporations. Rather, we, the people, admonish them. We, the people, having souls, know our rights are inherent and come by the hand of God, whereas these corporations are soulless and rely upon man for their privileges, masquerading as rights. We, the people, will continue to witness the destruction of the old guard, and we, the people, will build around, through, and without these corporations. So help us God. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. Like I said, today we are going to wrap up the book that we've been going through, The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand here today. Round out the last couple, 2-3 chapters here. First of all, I want to thank you if you're joining on the YouTube side. Thank you for tuning in this morning. We are up on Twitch. We are up on DLive as well. Good to have you aboard. And hello, salute to our friends over on the Tiger Network, Jim and company over there. Good to have you aboard. And last but not least, if it suits you and you want to get on a backup channel or two, we are up on Trovo as well as Vaughn Live. Get ourselves established over there as well. So that being said, let's just get right into it here this morning. And we'll get into the last of the reading. Again, if you're following along, coming into this late for the first time, we've had 5 sessions prior to this. You can go back on the channels here, on the archive channels, what have you, and pick up on the first 5 installments of this. But if you wish to pick it up, read it on your own, The Virtue of Selfishness, 50th Anniversary Edition. You can pick that up at Amazon or your book warehouse of choice. Certainly, that's from November 1st, 1964. And of course, like I said, we are going to pick this up here now on Chapter 17, dealing with racism here today. So that's where we're going to pick it up on page 120, and we'll pick it up now. So, racism. This was a epitaph, if you will, or an essay, rather, by Ayn Rand. And here we go. Racism is the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. It is the notion of ascribing moral, social, or political significance to a man's genetic lineage. The notion that a man's intellectual and characterological traits are produced and transmitted by his internal body chemistry, which means, in practice, that a man is to be judged not by his own character and actions, but by the characters and actions of a collective of ancestors. Racism claims that the content of a man's mind, not his cognitive apparatus, but its content, is inherited, that a man's convictions, values, and character are determined before he is born, by physical factors beyond his control. This is the caveman's version of the doctrine of innate ideas, or of inherited knowledge, which has been thoroughly refuted by philosophy and science. Racism is a doctrine of, by, and for brutes. It is a barnyard or stock farm version of collectivism, appropriate to a mentality that differentiates between various breeds of animals, but not between animals and men. And I guess I'll pause right there quick, because obviously we can quickly see how this is playing out here today. Vilify the white man, right? More reparations. We have to pass laws to protect the Asians. It's a typical divide and conquer strategy, folks, at the end of the day. Racism born back in the days of Hitler, Goebbels isms, and if you will, the very same tactics used back then, same used today. We will call that the classic playbook. Like every form of determinism, racism invalidates the specific attribute which distinguishes man from all other living species, his rational faculty. Racism negates 2 aspects of man's life, reason and choice, or mind and morality, replacing them with chemical predestination. The respectable family that supports worthless relatives or covers up their crimes in order to protect the family name, as if the moral stature of one man could be damaged by the actions of another. The bum who boasts his great-grandfather was an empire builder, or the small-town spinster who boasts that her maternal great-uncle was a state senator and her third cousin gave a concert at Carnegie Hall, as if the achievements of one man could rub off on the mediocrity of another. The parents who search genealogical trees in order to evaluate their prospective sons-in-law. The celebrity who starts his autobiography with a detailed account of his family history. All these are samples of racism, the atavistic manifestations of a doctrine whose full expression is the tribal warfare of prehistorical savages, the wholesale slaughter of Nazi Germany, the atrocities of today's so-called newly emerging nations. The theory that holds good blood or bad blood is a moral intellectual criterion can lead to nothing but torrents of blood in practice. Brute force is the only avenue of action open to men who regard themselves as mindless aggregates of chemicals. Modern racists attempt to prove the superiority or inferiority of a given race by the historical achievements of some of its members. The frequent historical spectacle of a great innovator who, in his lifetime, is jeered, denounced, obstructed, persecuted by his countrymen, and then, a few years after his death, is enshrined in a national monument and hailed as a proof of the greatness of the German, or French, or Italian, or Cambodian race, is as revolting a spectacle of collectivist expropriation perpetrated by racists as any expropriation of material wealth perpetrated by communists. And what did we just see play out in Minneapolis, after the Chauvin trial? Give it about 6 months, and I guarantee you we'll probably see a George Floyd statue in the works, won't we? Just as there is no such thing as a collective or racial mind, so there is no such thing as a collective or racial achievement. There are only individual minds and individual achievements, and a culture is not the anonymous product of undifferentiated masses, but the sum of the intellectual achievements of individual men. Even if it were proved, which it is not, that the incidence of men of potentially superior brain power is greater among the members of certain races than among the members of others, it would still tell us nothing about any given individual, and it would be irrelevant to one's judgment of him. A genius is a genius, regardless of the number of morons who belong to the same race. And a moron is a moron, regardless of the number of geniuses who share his racial origin. It is hard to say which is the more outrageous injustice: the claim of Southern racists that a Negro genius should be treated as an inferior because his race has produced some brutes, or the claim of a German brute to the status of a superior because his race has produced Goethe, Schiller, and Brahms. These are not two different claims, of course, but two applications of the same basic premise. The question of whether one alleges the superiority or the inferiority of any given race is irrelevant. Racism has only one psychological root: the racist sense of his own inferiority. Like every other form of collectivism, racism is a quest for the unearned. It is a quest for automatic knowledge, for an automatic evaluation of men's characters that bypasses the responsibility of exercising rational or moral judgment, and, above all, a quest for an automatic self-esteem, or pseudo-self-esteem. To ascribe one's virtues to one's racial origin is to confess that one has no knowledge of the process by which virtues are acquired, and, most often, that one has failed to acquire them. The overwhelming majority of racists are men who have earned no sense of personal identity, who can claim no individual achievement or distinction, and who seek the illusion of a tribal self-esteem by alleging the inferiority of some other tribe. Observe the hysterical intensity of the Southern racists. Observe also that racism is much more prevalent among the poor white trash than among their intellectual betters. Historically, racism has always risen or fallen with the rise or fall of collectivism. Collectivism holds that the individual has no rights, that his life and work belong to the group, to society, to the tribe, the state, the nation, and that the group may sacrifice him at its own whim to its own interests. The only way to implement a doctrine of that kind is by means of brute force, and statism has always been the political corollary of collectivism. The absolute state is merely an institutionalized form of gang rule, regardless of which particular gang seizes power, and since there is no rational justification for such rule, since none has ever been or can ever be offered, the mystique of racism is a crucial element in every variant of the absolute state. The relationship is reciprocal. Statism rises out of prehistorical tribal warfare, out of the notion that men of one tribe are the natural prey for the men of another, and establishes its own internal subcategories of racism, a system of caste determined by a man's birth, such as inherited titles of nobility or inherited serfdom. And I guess I'll pause real quick there again and say, talking about the political gang rule. What do we always hear, folks? What do we hear all the time about democracy? Democracy. Isn't that just gang rule, 51% rule, regardless of who is in charge at the end of the day? Two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner? No. Reject that. It's a constitutional republic where the right of the individual is protected. And titles of nobility. Where have we heard that before? Go back and listen to my Federalist Papers. It's riddled throughout the Federalist Papers. And that's exactly what they don't want you to know, and it's exactly why the original 13th Amendment was scrubbed for what we have here on paper today. Go back, do your research. The racism of Nazi Germany, where men had to fill questionnaires about their ancestry for generations back in order to prove their Aryan descent, has its counterpart in Soviet Russia, where men had to fill similar questionnaires to show that their ancestors had owned no property and thus to prove their proletarian descent. The Soviet ideology rests on the notion that men can be conditioned to communism genetically. That is, that a few generations conditioned by dictatorship will transmit communist ideology to their descendants, who will be communists at birth. The persecution of racial minorities in Soviet Russia, according to the racial descent and whim of any given commissar, is a matter of record. Anti-Semitism is particularly prevalent. Only the official pogroms are now called political purges. There is only one antidote to racism: the philosophy of individualism and its politico-economic corollary, laissez-faire capitalism. Individualism regards every man, as an independent, sovereign entity who possesses an inalienable right to his own life, a right derived from his nature as a rational being. Individualism, boy, having trouble with that word here today. Individualism holds that a civilized society or any form of association, cooperation, or peaceful coexistence among men can be achieved only on the basis of the recognition of individual rights, and that a group, as such, has no rights other than the individual rights of its members. And of course, we covered that in chapters 12 and 13. And I guess I'll pause yet again to say that is precisely why, going through the Federalist Papers is absolutely important. Yes, at some point I'll probably circle back and hit the Federalist Papers versus Anti-Federalist so we can get the point-counterpoint view of everything. But also precisely why it's probably going to be important to cover the next book that I think we'll cover here on the channel. And that's going to be Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where exactly, as Ayn Rand points out here, laissez-faire capitalism is absolutely essential to individual rights. It is not a man's ancestors or relatives or genes or body chemistry that count in a free market, but only one human attribute: productive ability. It is by his own individual ability and ambition that capitalism judges a man and rewards him accordingly. No political system can establish universal rationality by law or by force, but capitalism is the only system that functions in a way which rewards rationality and penalizes all forms of irrationality, including racism. A fully free capitalist system has not yet existed anywhere. But what is enormously significant is the correlation of racism and political controls in the semi-free economies of the 19th century. Racial and/or religious persecutions of minorities stood in inverse ratio to the degree of a country's freedom. Racism was strongest in the more controlled economies, such as Russia and Germany, and weakest in England, the then freest country of Europe. It is capitalism that gave mankind its first steps toward freedom and a rational way of life. It is capitalism that broke through national and racial barriers by means of free trade. It is capitalism that abolished serfdom and slavery in all the civilized countries of the world. It is the capitalist North that destroyed the slavery of the agrarian feudal South in the United States. Such was the trend of mankind for the brief span of some 150 years. The spectacular results and achievements of that trend need no restatement here. The rise of collectivism reversed that trend. When men began to be indoctrinated once more with the notion that the individual possesses no rights, that supremacy, moral authority, and unlimited power belong to the group, and that a man has no significance outside his group, the inevitable consequence was that men began to gravitate toward some group or another, in self-protection, in bewilderment, and in subconscious terror. The simplest collective to join, the easiest one to identify, Particularly for people of limited intelligence, the least demanding form of belonging and of togetherness is race. It is thus the theoreticians of collectivism, the humanitarian advocates of a benevolent absolute state, have led to the rebirth and the new virulent growth of racism in the 20th century. It is in its great era of capitalism, the United States was the freest country on earth and the best refutation of racist theories. Men of all races came here, some from obscure, culturally undistinguished countries, and accomplished feats of productive ability which would have remained stillborn in their control-ridden native lands. Men of racial groups that had been slaughtering one another for centuries learned to live together in harmony and peaceful cooperation. America had been called the melting pot, with good reason. But few people realized that America did not melt men into the gray conformity of a collective. She united them by means of protecting their right to individuality. The major victims of such race prejudice as did exist in America were the Negroes. It was a problem originated and perpetuated by the non-capitalist South, though not confined to its boundaries. The persecution of Negroes in the South was and is truly disgraceful. But in the rest of the country, so long as men were free, even that problem was slowly giving way under the pressure of enlightenment and of the white men's own economic interests. Today, that problem is growing worse, and so is every other form of racism. America has become race-conscious in a manner reminiscent of the worst days in the most backward countries of 19th century Europe. The cause is the same, the growth of collectivism and statism. In spite of the clamor for racial equality propagated by the liberals in the past few decades, the Census Bureau reported recently that the Negro's economic status relative to whites has not improved for nearly 20 years. It had been improving in the freer years of our mixed economy. It deteriorated with the progressive enlargement of the liberals' welfare state. The growth of racism in a mixed economy keeps step with the growth of government controls. A mixed economy disintegrates a country into an institutionalized civil war of pressure groups, each fighting for legislative favors and special privileges at the expense of one another. The existence of such pressure groups and other political lobbies is openly and cynically acknowledged today. The pretense that any political philosophy, any principles, ideals, or long-range goals is fast disappearing from our scene, and it is all but admitted that this country is now floating without direction, at the mercy of a blind, short-range power game played by various statist gangs, each intent on getting hold of a legislative gun for any special advantage of the immediate moment. In the absence of any coherent political philosophy, every economic group has been acting as its own destroyer, selling out its future for some momentary privilege. The policy of the businessmen has, for some time, been the most suicidal one in this respect, but it has been surpassed by the current policy of the Negro leaders. So long as the Negro leaders were fighting against government-enforced discrimination, right, justice, and morality were on their side. But that is not what they are fighting any longer. The confusions and contradictions surrounding the issue of racism have now reached an incredible climax. It is time to clarify the principles involved. The policy of the Southern states toward Negroes was and is a shameful contradiction of this country's basic principles. Racial discrimination, imposed and enforced by law, is so blatantly inexcusable an infringement of individual rights that the racist statutes of the South should have been declared unconstitutional long ago. The Southern racist claim of states' rights is a contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing as the right of some men to violate the rights of others. The constitutional concept of states' rights pertains to the division of power between local and national authorities, and serves to protect the states from the federal government. It does not grant to a state government an unlimited, arbitrary power over its citizens, or the privilege of abrogating the citizens' individual rights. It is true that the federal government has used the racial issue to enlarge its own power and to set a precedent of encroachment upon the legitimate rights of the states in an unnecessary and unconstitutional manner. But this merely means that both governments are wrong. It does not excuse the policy of the Southern racists. One of the worst contradictions in this context is the stand of many so-called conservatives, not confined exclusively to the South, who claim to be defenders of freedom, of capitalism, of property rights, of the Constitution, yet who advocate racism at the same time. They do not seem to possess enough concern with principles to realize that they are cutting the ground from under their own feet. Men who deny individual rights cannot claim, defend, or uphold any rights whatsoever. It is such alleged champions of capitalism who are helping to discredit and destroy it. The liberals are guilty of the same contradiction, but in a different form. They advocate the sacrifice of all individual rights to unlimited majority rule, yet posture as defenders of the rights of minorities. But the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. This accumulation of contradictions, of short-sighted pragmatism, of cynical contempt for principles, of outrageous irrationality, has now reached its climax in the new demands of the Negro leaders. Instead of fighting against racial discrimination, they are demanding that racial discrimination be legalized and enforced. Instead of fighting against racism, they are demanding the establishment of racial quotas. Instead of fighting for color blindness and social and economic issues, they are proclaiming that color blindness is evil and that color should be made a primary consideration. Instead of fighting for equal rights, they are demanding special race privileges. They are demanding that racial quotas be established in regard to employment and that jobs be distributed on a racial basis in proportion to the percentage of a given race among the local population. For instance, since Negroes constitute 25% of the population of New York City, they demand 25% of the jobs in a given establishment. Let that sink in, folks. How much different is that from what we still see playing out here today? Did we not just hear about certain airlines doing the very same thing? It's not about the content of what you know, but no, it's about the quotas and that must be met because the government said so. Racial quotas have been one of the worst evils of racist regimes. There were racial quotas in the universities of Tsarist Russia, in the population of Russia's major cities, etc. One of the accusations against the racists in this country is that some schools practice a secret system of racial quotas. It was regarded as a victory for justice when employment questionnaires ceased to inquire about an applicant's race or religion. Today, it is not an oppressor, but an oppressed minority group that is demanding the establishment of racial quotas. This particular demand was too much even for the liberals. Many of them denounced it, properly, with shocked indignation. Wrote the New York Times, July 23, 1963. The demonstrators are following a truly vicious principle and playing the numbers game. A demand that 25% or any other percentage of jobs be given to Negroes or any other group is wrong for one basic reason. It calls for a quota system, which is in itself discriminatory. This newspaper has long fought a religious quota in respect to judgeships. We equally oppose a racial quota in respect to jobs from the most elevated to the most menial. As if the blatant racism of such a demand were not enough, some Negro leaders went still farther. Whitney M. Young, Jr., Executive Director of the National Urban League, made the following statement. New York Times, August 1st. The white leadership must be honest enough to grant that throughout our history there has existed a special privileged class of citizens who received preferred treatment. That class was white. Now we're saying this. If two men, one Negro and one white, are equally qualified for a job, hire the Negro. Consider the implications of that statement. It does not merely demand special privileges on racial grounds, it demands that white men be penalized for the sins of their ancestors. It demands that a white laborer be refused a job because his grandfather may have practiced racial discrimination. But perhaps his grandfather had not practiced it, or perhaps his grandfather had not even lived in this country. Since these questions are not to be considered, it means that the white laborer is to be charged with collective racial guilt, the guilt consisting merely of the color of his skin. But that is the principle of the worst Southern racist, who charges all Negroes with collective racial guilt for any crime committed by an individual Negro, and who treats them all as inferiors on the grounds their ancestors were savages. The only comment one can make about demands of that kind is, by what right? By what code? By what standard? That absurdly evil policy is destroying the moral base of the Negroes' fight. Their case rested on the principle of individual rights. If they demand the violation of the rights of others, they negate and forfeit their own. Then the same answer applies to them as to the Southern racists. There can be no such thing as the right of some men to violate the rights of others. Yet the entire policy of the Negro leaders is now moving in that direction. For instance, the demand for racial quotas in schools, with a proposal that hundreds of children, white and Negro, be forced to attend school in distant neighborhoods for the purpose of racial balance. Again, this is pure racism. As opponents of this demand have pointed out, to assign children to certain schools by reason of their race is equally evil, whether one does it for purposes of segregation or integration. And the mere idea of using children as pawns in a political game should outrage all parents of any race, creed, or color. The Civil Rights Bill, now under consideration in Congress, is another example of a gross infringement of individual rights. It is proper to forbid all discrimination in government-owned facilities and establishments. The government has no right to discriminate against any citizens. And by the very same principle, the government has no right to discriminate for some citizens at the expense of others. It has no right to violate the rights of private property by forbidding discrimination in privately owned establishments. No man, neither Negro nor white, has any claim to the property of another man. A man's rights are not violated by a private individual's refusal to deal with him. Racism is an evil, irrational, and morally contemptible doctrine. But doctrines cannot be forbidden or prescribed by law. Just as we have to protect a communist freedom of speech, even though his doctrines are evil, so we have to protect a racist's rights to the use and disposal of his own property. Private racism is not a legal, but a moral issue, and can be fought only by private means, such as economic boycott or social ostracism. Needless to say, if that civil rights bill is passed, it will be the worst breach of property rights in the sorry record of American history in respect to that subject. It is an ironic demonstration of the philosophical insanity and the consequently suicidal trend of our age that the men who need the protection of individual rights most urgently, the Negroes, are now in the vanguard of the destruction of these rights. A word of warning: do not become victims of the same racists by succumbing to racism. Do not hold against all Negroes the disgraceful irrationality of some of their leaders. No group has any proper intellectual leadership today or any proper representation. In conclusion, I shall quote from an astonishing editorial in the New York Times of August 4th. Astonishing because ideas of this nature are not typical of our age. But the question must be not whether a group recognizable in color, features, or culture has its rights as a group. No, the question is whether any American individual, regardless of color, features, or culture, is deprived of his rights as an American. If the individual has all the rights and privileges due him under the laws and the Constitution, we need not worry about groups and masses. Those do not, in fact, exist, except as figures of speech. Interesting. That penned back in September 1963. And of course, again, flash forward 60 years later, are we not fighting the very same things? Nothing new under the sun, right? At the end of the day. And of course, if you look at the tenets of communism, Marxism, the BLMs, the Antifas, and that are out on the streets today, what are the one thing that both of those agree on? That's talked about here in this particular essay is the fact that nobody has the rights to property rights, right? And of course, it's also for the very same reason that we see what was in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, before it was pursuit of happiness, it used to actually be property, land. Go back and look at your individual state constitutions. Many of those that were ratified, and as the states were brought into the fold, and these United States had life, liberty, land, and were later rewritten to disclude land in favor of pursuit of happiness. And so, little by little, the indoctrination keeps coming along until people believe they don't have a right to the land. And in some cases, even yourself as a piece of property. I mean, look at what's playing out with COVID. They think that you need to go along to get along. You don't have a right to control what goes in your body. No, take the jab, they said. Right? That's where this is all headed. All right, let's move on to Chapter 18, Counterfeit Individualism by Nathaniel Branden. It says a theory of individualism is a central component of the objectivist philosophy. Individualism is at once an ethical political concept and an ethical psychological one. As an ethical political concept, individualism upholds the supremacy of individual rights, the principle that man is an end in himself, not a means to the ends of others. As an ethical psychological concept, individualism holds that man should think and judge independently, valuing nothing higher than the sovereignty of his intellect. The philosophical base and validation of individualism, as Ayn Rand has shown in Atlas Shrugged, is the fact that individualism, ethically, politically, and psychologically, is an objective requirement of man's proper survival, of man's survival qua man, qua rational being. It is implicit in and necessitated by a code of ethics that holds man's life as its standard of value. The advocacy of individualism, as such, is not new. What is new is the objectivist validation of the theory of individualism and the definition of a consistent way to practice it. Too often, the ethical political meaning of individualism is held to be doing whatever one wishes, regardless of the rights of others. Writers such as Nietzsche and Max Stirner are sometimes quoted in support of this interpretation. Altruists and collectivists have an obvious vested interest in persuading men that such is the meaning of individualism, that the man who refuses to be sacrificed intends to sacrifice others. The contradiction in, and refutation of, such an interpretation of individualism is this. Since the only rational base of individualism as an ethical principle is the requirements of man's survival qua man, one man cannot claim the moral right to violate the rights of another. If he denies inviolate rights to other men, he cannot claim such rights for himself. He has rejected the base of rights. No one can claim the moral right to a contradiction. Individualism does not consist merely of rejecting the belief that man should live for the collective. A man who seeks escape from the responsibility of supporting his life by his own thought and effort, and wishes to survive by conquering, ruling, and exploiting others, is not an individualist. An individualist is a man who lives for his own sake and by his own mind. He neither sacrifices himself to others, nor sacrifices others to himself. He deals with men as a trader, not as a looter, as a producer, not as an Attila. It is the recognition of this distinction that altruists and collectivists wish men to lose, the distinction between a trader and a looter, between a producer and an Attila. If the meaning of individualism, in its ethical political context, has been perverted and debased predominantly by its avowed antagonists, the meaning of individualism, in its ethical psychological context, has been perverted and debased predominantly by its professed supporters, by those who wish to dissolve the distinction between an independent judgment and a subjective whim. These are the alleged individualists who equate individualism not with independent thought, but with independent feelings. There are no such things as independent feelings. There is only an independent mind. An individualist is, first and foremost, a man of reason. It is upon the ability to think, upon his rational faculty, that man's life depends. Rationality is the precondition of independence and self-reliance. An individualist who is neither independent nor self-reliant is a contradiction in terms. Individualism and independence are logically inseparable. The basic independence of the individualist consists of his loyalty to his own mind. It is his perception of the facts of reality, his understanding, his judgment, that he refuses to sacrifice to the unproved assertions of others. That is the meaning of intellectual independence, and that is the essence of an individualist. He is dispassionately and intransigently fact-centered. Man needs knowledge in order to survive, and only reason can achieve it. Men who reject the responsibility of thought and reason can exist only as parasites on the thinking of others. And a parasite is not an individualist. The irrationalist, the whim worshipper, who regards knowledge and objectivity as restrictions on his freedom, the range of the moment hedonist who acts on his private feelings, is not an individualist. The independence that an irrationalist seeks is independence from reality, like Dostoevsky's underground man who cries, "What do I care for the laws of nature and arithmetic when, for some reason, I dislike those laws and the fact that twice 2 makes 4. Gee, what does that sound an awful lot like? We just got done reading about racism, right? Math is now racist. 2 plus 2 is a white man's deal. 2 plus 2 could potentially equal 5, you say? Independence from reality. Let that sink in. To the irrationalist, existence is merely a clash between his whims and the whims of others. The concept of an objective reality has no reality to him. Rebelliousness or unconventionality, as such, do not constitute proof of individualism, just as individualism does not consist merely of rejecting collectivism. So it does not consist merely of the absence of conformity. A conformist is a man who declares, "It's true because others believe it." But an individualist is not a man who declares it's true because I believe it. An individualist declares, "I believe it because I see in reason that it's true." There is an incident in the Fountainhead that is worth recalling in this connection. In the chapter on the life and career of collectivist Ellsworth Toohey, Ayn Rand describes the various groups of writers and artists that Toohey organized. There was a woman who never used capitals in her books, and a man who never used commas, and another who wrote poems that neither rhymed nor scanned. There was a boy who used no canvas, but did something with bird cages and metronomes. A few friends pointed out to Ellsworth Toohey that he seemed guilty of inconsistency. He was so deeply opposed to individualism, they said, and here were all these writers and artists of his, and every one of them was a rabid individualist. "Do you really think so?" said Toohey, smiling blandly. What Toohey knew and what students of objectivism would do well to understand, is that such subjectivists, in their rebellion against the tyranny of reality, are less independent and more abjectly parasitical than the most commonplace Babbitt, whom they profess to despise. They originate or create nothing. They are profoundly selfless, and they struggle to fill the void of the egos they do not possess, by means of the only form of self-assertiveness they recognize: defiance for the sake of defiance, irrationality for the sake of irrationality, destruction for the sake of destruction, whims for the sake of whims. A psychotic is scarcely likely to be accused of conformity, but neither a psychotic nor a subjectivist is an exponent of individualism. Observe the common denominator in the attempts to corrupt the meaning of individualism as an ethical political concept and as an ethical psychological concept. The attempt to divorce individualism from reason. But it is only in the context of reason and man's needs as a rational being that the principle of individualism can be justified. Torn out of this context, any advocacy of individualism becomes as arbitrary and irrational as the advocacy of collectivism. This is the basis of objectivism's total opposition to any alleged individualists who attempt to equate individualism with subjectivism. And this is the basis of objectivism's total repudiation of any self-styled objectivists who permit themselves to believe that any compromise, meeting ground, or rapprochement is possible between objectivism and that counterfeit individualism, which consists of declaring it's right because I feel it, or it's good because I want it, or it's true because I believe it. That penned in April 1962. Collectivism, objectivism, a lot of isms going on here. Maybe worth going back, re-listening, rereading at some point to let that sink in. But obviously, reason, rationality are key to the individualist. And of course, we see our friends on the opposing side not exactly square with that tenement, are we? And last but not least, on the day, Chapter 19, the argument from intimidation. Essay penned by Ayn Rand here. Says there is a certain type of argument which, in fact, is not an argument, but a means of forestalling debate and extorting an opponent's agreement with one's undiscussed notions. It is a method of bypassing logic by means of psychological pressure. Since it is particularly prevalent in today's culture, and is going to grow more so in the next few months, one would do well to learn to identify it and be on guard against it. This method bears a certain resemblance to the fallacy ad hominem and comes from the same psychological root, but is different in essential meaning. The ad hominem fallacy consists of attempting to refute an argument by impeaching the character of its proponent. Example: Candidate X is immoral, therefore his argument is false. But the psychological pressure method consists of threatening to impeach an opponent's character by means of his argument, thus impeaching the argument without debate. Example: only the immoral can fail to see that Candidate X's argument is false. In the first case, Candidate X's immorality, real or invented, is offered as proof of the falsehood of his argument. In the second case, the falsehood of his argument is asserted arbitrarily and offered as proof of his immorality. In today's epistemological jungle, that second method is used more frequently than any other type of irrational argument. It should be classified as a logical fallacy and may be designated as the argument from intimidation. The essential characteristic of the argument from intimidation is its appeal to moral self-doubt and its reliance on the fear, guilt, or ignorance of the victim. It is used in the form of an ultimatum demanding that the victim renounce a given idea without discussion, under threat of being considered morally unworthy. The pattern is always, only those who are evil dishonest, heartless, insensitive, ignorant, etc., can hold such an idea. The classic example of the argument from intimidation is the story, The Emperor's New Clothes. In that story, some charlatans sell non-existent garments to the emperor by asserting that the garment's unusual beauty makes them invisible to those who are morally depraved at heart. Observe the psychological factors required to make this work. The charlatans rely on the emperor's self-doubt. The emperor does not question their assertion, nor their moral authority. He surrenders at once, claiming he does not see the garments, thus denying the evidence of his own eyes and invalidating his own consciousness, rather than face a threat to his precarious self-esteem. His distance from reality may be gauged by the fact that he prefers to walk naked down the street, displaying his non-existent garments to the people, rather than risk incurring the moral condemnation of two scoundrels. The people, prompted by the same psychological panic, try to surpass one another in loud exclamations on the splendor of his clothes, until a child cries out that the emperor is naked. This is the exact pattern of the working of the argument from intimidation, as it is being worked all around us today. We have all heard it, and are hearing it constantly. Only those who lack finer instincts can fail to accept the morality of altruism. Only the ignorant can fail to know that reason has been invalidated. Only black-hearted reactionaries can advocate capitalism. Only warmongers can oppose the United Nations. Only the lunatic fringe can still believe in freedom. Only cowards can fail to see that life is a sower. Only the superficial can seek beauty, happiness, achievement, values, or heroes. And on it goes. I'm sure we could probably come up with a few examples in today's times, right? Only a conspiracy theorist would believe that Q is actually real, right? And on and on. As an example of an entire field of activity based on nothing but the argument from intimidation, I give you modern art, where, in order to prove that they do possess a special insight possessed only by the mystic elite, the populace are trying to surpass one another in loud exclamations on the splendor of some bare but smudged piece of canvas. The argument from intimidation dominates today's discussions in two forms, in public speeches and print. It flourishes in the form of long, involved, elaborate structures of unintelligible verbiage, which conveys nothing clearly except a moral threat. Only the primitive-minded can fail to realize that clarity is oversimplification. But in private, day-to-day experience, it comes up wordlessly between the lines, in the form of inarticulate sounds conveying unstated implications. It relies not on what is said, but on how it is said. Not on content, but on tone of voice. The tone is usually one of scornful or belligerent incredulity. Surely you are not an advocate of capitalism, are you? And if this does not intimidate the prospective victim who answers properly, I am, the ensuing dialogue goes something like this. Oh, you couldn't be. Not really. Really. But everybody knows that capitalism is outdated. I don't. Oh, come now. Since I don't know it, will you please tell me the reasons for thinking that capitalism is outdated? Oh, don't be ridiculous. Will you tell me the reasons? Well, really, if you don't know, I couldn't possibly tell you. All this is accompanied by raised eyebrows, wide-eyed stares, shrugs, grunts, snickers, and the entire arsenal of non-verbal signals communicating ominous innuendos and emotional vibrations of a single kind, disapproval. If those vibrations fail, if such debaters are challenged, one finds that they have no arguments, no evidence, no proof, no reason, no ground to stand on, that their noisy aggressiveness serves to hide a vacuum, that the argument from intimidation is a confession of intellectual impotence. The primordial archetype of that argument is obvious, and so are the reasons of its appeal to the neo-mysticism of our age. To those who understand, no explanation is necessary. To those who don't, none is possible. The psychological source of that argument is social metaphysics. A social metaphysician is one who regards the consciousness of other men as superior to his own and to the facts of reality. It is to a social metaphysician that the moral appraisal of himself by others is a primary concern, which supersedes truth, facts, reason, logic. The disapproval of others is so shatteringly terrifying to him that nothing can withstand its impact within his consciousness. Thus he would deny the evidence of his own eyes, and invalidate his own consciousness for the sake of any stray charlatan's moral sanction. It is only a social metaphysician who could conceive of such absurdity as hoping to win an intellectual argument by hinting, "But people won't like you." Strictly speaking, a social metaphysician does not conceive of his argument in conscious terms. He finds it instinctively by introspection, since it represents his psycho-epistemological way of life. We have all met the exasperating type of person who does not listen to what one says, but to the emotional vibrations of one's voice, anxiously translating them into approval or disapproval, then answering accordingly. This is a kind of self-imposed argument from intimidation, to which a social metaphysician surrenders in most of his human encounters. And thus, when he meets an adversary, when his premises are challenged, he resorts automatically to the weapon that terrifies him most, the withdrawal of a moral sanction. Since that kind of terror is unknown to psychologically healthy men, they may be taken in by the argument from intimidation, precisely because of their innocence. Unable to understand that argument's motive or to believe that it is merely a senseless bluff, they assume that its user has some sort of knowledge or reasons to back up his seemingly self-confident, belligerent assertions. They give him the benefit of the doubt, and are left in helplessly bewildered confusion. It is thus that the social metaphysicians can victimize the young, the innocent, the conscientious. This is particularly prevalent in college classrooms. Many professors use the argument from intimidation to stifle independent thinking among the students, to evade questions they cannot answer, to discourage any critical analysis of their arbitrary assumptions, or any departure from the intellectual status quo. Aristotle, my dear fellow, a weary sigh, if you had read Professor Spifkin's piece in, reverently, the January 1912 issue of Intellect magazine, which, contemptuously, you obviously haven't, you would know, early, that Aristotle has been refuted. Professor X, X standing for the name of a distinguished theorist of free enterprise economics, are you quoting Professor X? Oh no, not really. Followed by a sarcastic chuckle intended to convey that Professor X had been thoroughly discredited. By whom? Blank out. Such teachers are frequently assisted by the liberal goon squad of the classroom, who burst into laughter at appropriate moments. In our political life, the argument from intimidation is the almost exclusive method of discussion. Predominantly, today's political debates consist of smears and apologies, or intimidation and appeasement. The first is usually, though not exclusively, practiced by the liberals, the second by the conservatives. The champions, in this respect, are the liberal Republicans who practice both, the first toward their conservative fellow Republicans, the second toward the Democrats. All smears are arguments from intimidation. They consist of derogatory assertions, without any evidence or proof, offered as a substitute for evidence or proof, aimed at the moral cowardice or unthinking credulity of the hearers. The argument from intimidation is not new. It has been used in all ages and cultures, but seldom on so wide a scale as today. It is used more crudely in politics than in any other fields of activity, but it is not confined to politics. It permeates our entire culture. It is a symptom of cultural bankruptcy. How does one resist that argument? There is only one weapon against it: moral certainty. When one enters into any intellectual battle, big or small, public or private, one cannot seek, desire, or expect the enemy's sanction. Truth or falsehood must be one's sole concern and sole criterion of judgment, not anyone's approval or disapproval, and above all, not the approval of those whose standards are the opposite of one's own. Let me emphasize that the argument from intimidation does not consist of introducing moral judgment into intellectual issues, but of substituting moral judgment for intellectual argument. Moral evaluations are implicit in most intellectual issues. It is not merely permissible, but mandatory to pass moral judgment when and where appropriate. To suppress such judgment is an act of moral cowardice. But a moral judgment must always follow, not precede or supersede, the reasons on which it is based. When one gives reasons for one's verdict, one assumes responsibility for it and lays oneself open to objective judgment. If one's reasons are wrong or false, one suffers the consequences. But to condemn without giving reasons is an act of irresponsibility, a kind of moral hit-and-run driving, which is the essence of the argument from intimidation. Observe that the men who use that argument are the ones who dread a reasoned moral attack more than any other kind of battle. And when they encounter a morally confident adversary, they are loudest in protesting that moralizing should be kept out of intellectual discussions. But to discuss evil in a manner implying neutrality is to sanction it. The argument from intimidation illustrates why it is important to be certain of one's premises and of one's moral ground. It illustrates the kind of intellectual pitfall that awaits those who venture forth without a full, clear, consistent set of convictions, wholly integrated all the way down to fundamentals. Those who recklessly leap into battle, armed with nothing but a few random notions floating in a fog of the unknown, the unidentified, the undefined, the unproved, and supported by nothing but their feelings, hopes, and fears. The argument from intimidation is their nemesis. In moral and intellectual issues, it is not enough to be right. One has to know that one is right. The most illustrious example of the proper answer to the argument from intimidation was given in American history by the man who, rejecting the enemy's moral standards, and with full certainty of his own rectitude, said, "If this be treason, make the most of it." If this be treason, make the most of it. That penned by Ayn Rand back in July 1964. And that brings us to the conclusion of the book. So, that being said, what sort of examples do you see out there today that are very, very similar to what we see playing out here, just like what was spelled out in this last chapter? Let's use the election as an example. You know, don't believe your lying eyes. Is that a good example? Argument from intimidation. Obviously, the courts, the media, everybody says Joe Biden won the election, right? At the end of the day? Or do the facts prove otherwise? Well, we have yet to have a court of law suggest that evidence has been submitted, all but two. Antrim County, as an example, and now perhaps Maricopa County that they've fought tooth and nail over. But, of course, you could see how these very same arguments would be used to try and discredit the individual by the left, right? So, many examples. Again, many of these essays written back in the 60s, I don't even want to dare say we've come full circle. I'm not sure we even got around the circle at the end of the day. The circle is still forming, and here we are again some 50, 60 years later, still dealing with the same damn issues. And racism, as we just covered at the top of the broadcast, chapter 17 here. Again, a lot of those arguments net still playing out here today, and it's a bankrupt philosophy at the end of the day. And of course, again, thinking back to the Constitution being for a moral people. What happens when you have immoral people not only in charge, but those trying to come against us with their immorality? well, we get exactly what's playing out here today, don't we? So, again, this concludes the reading of Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Again, you can always go back and listen to these afterwards, after the broadcast. Go back, listen to them. They're up on the archive channels, whatnot. Tonight, don't forget to join me over on the Soapbox right after Radix tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern. I'll be over there, and I'll probably continue this discussion a little bit into the topic I'm going to cover here tonight. And that's actually going to be delving into our education system, the indoctrination camps, the whole 1619, the all that stuff, and how we can combat that with the 1776 project and that, which I did a long read of, about 2.5 hours to get through that deal after Trump left office, the report that came out in that regard, and how that all folds back into this as well. So don't forget to join me for that here later on this evening. Again, that's over on the Soapbox about 9 p.m. I'll be over there for that. And again, appreciate you guys tuning in. Next up, we'll probably get into some news as well as get into Alexis de Tocqueville next. So stay tuned, stick around. See you back on the next one. Take care. God bless everybody.